Ladies and gentlemen, in a world that celebrates loud confidence, fast success, and aggressive ambition, the empath often grows up feeling out of place. In many cultures, strength is still defined by volume, speed, and dominance. From childhood, people are rewarded for speaking first, pushing harder, and standing out boldly. In such environments, the empath often feels misaligned, not because they lack ability, but because their strengths operate on a different frequency. Empaths are naturally attuned to emotional cues, subtle shifts in mood, and the unspoken dynamics between people. Yet these skills are rarely named, taught, or valued early in life. As a result, the empath's early experiences can feel confusing and even discouraging. They may be told they are too sensitive, too quiet, or too affected by things others seem to brush off. In classrooms, workplaces, and families, assertiveness is often mistaken for competence, while emotional awareness is seen as fragility. This mislabeling creates a false narrative that empathy is a weakness to be overcome rather than an intelligence to be developed. Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence helps clarify why this misunderstanding is so common. Traditional measures of success have long focused on cognitive ability, how quickly someone learns, analyzes, or competes. Emotional skills, by contrast, develop more quietly. They involve recognizing one's own emotions, understanding how feelings influence behavior, and perceiving the emotional states of others. These abilities do not always produce immediate, visible results, especially in fast-paced, competitive settings. For the empath, this mismatch can lead to early self-doubt. They may over-adapt to please others, suppress their emotional awareness, or try to imitate more aggressive personalities to fit in. This effort is draining. Emotional sensitivity, when unsupported, becomes a source of stress rather than insight. The empath absorbs tension in the environment, feels responsible for harmony, and carries emotional burdens that are not theirs to hold. Yet what appears as weakness in these early years is often the byproduct of an environment that rewards only a narrow definition of strength. The empath is not failing. They are simply developing capacities that are invisible in systems designed to notice only overt performance. Emotional intelligence grows through reflection, experience, and self-regulation, processes that take time and maturity. Goleman emphasizes that emotions drive attention, decision-making, and relationships. When these forces are ignored, people may succeed briefly but struggle with burnout, conflict, or poor leadership. Empaths sense these undercurrents instinctively, even when they lack the language to explain them. Early in life, this sensitivity can feel like standing against the current. Later, it becomes the very skill that allows them to navigate complexity with clarity. In this way, the empath's early struggle is less a personal shortcoming and more a cultural blind spot. Sensitivity is not the opposite of strength. It is the foundation of awareness. And awareness, once understood and managed, becomes one of the most powerful tools a person can possess. While the empath's early years may be marked by confusion or self-doubt, something important is happening beneath the surface. Every emotionally charged interaction becomes a lesson. Every moment of tension, misunderstanding, or connection is quietly shaping a deeper form of intelligence. Unlike skills that are taught explicitly, emotional intelligence is often learned indirectly, through experience, reflection, and repeated exposure to human complexity. Empaths, by their nature, receive more of this exposure than most. When a room feels uneasy, the empath notices it. When someone says the right words but carries a conflicting emotion, the empath senses the gap. These observations are not always conscious, but they accumulate. Over time, patterns begin to form. The empath learns how fear disguises itself as anger, how insecurity can look like arrogance, and how silence often communicates more than speech. This is not academic knowledge, it is experiential understanding. Daniel Goleman has often pointed out that emotional intelligence is rooted in awareness, first of the self and then of others. For empaths, awareness of others tends to come early, sometimes before they have fully developed awareness of themselves. This imbalance can be uncomfortable, but it is also educational. By feeling the emotional impact of situations so directly, empaths are compelled to make sense of them. They reflect more, They replay conversations. They try to understand not just what happened, but why it happened. This reflective habit is crucial. Reflection strengthens the neural pathways associated with emotional regulation and insight. Over time, the empath begins to recognize their own emotional responses with greater clarity. They start to distinguish between emotions that originate within them and emotions they have absorbed from their environment. This differentiation is a key milestone in emotional maturity, and it is often reached through trial and error rather than instruction. Pain in this process becomes a teacher. Moments of rejection, conflict, or misunderstanding force the empath to look inward. Why did this hurt so deeply? What was triggered? What need went unmet? These questions, asked repeatedly over the years, build a sophisticated inner map of emotional cause and effect. While others may avoid discomfort, empaths tend to engage with it because they feel it so intensely that it cannot be ignored. Goleman's research suggests that such engagement, when paired with reflection, leads to greater emotional competence. The empath learns not only to recognize emotions, but to anticipate them. They become skilled at reading early signals and understanding how emotional states influence behavior and decision-making. This is why, later in life, empaths often appear intuitive or insightful. What looks like intuition is usually the result of long-term emotional learning. By the time these skills fully surface, the empath has already spent years in quiet study. They may not have been aiming for mastery, but mastery emerges nonetheless. Emotional intelligence, shaped through lived experience, becomes a steady and reliable guide, one that allows the empath to navigate relationships, challenges, and leadership with depth and precision. For much of an empath's early life, empathy operates without clear limits. The ability to feel deeply and understand others is present, but the skill of managing that ability is still undeveloped. As a result, emotional openness can turn into emotional exposure. Empaths may take on responsibility for other people's moods, tolerate unhealthy dynamics, or equate kindness with endurance. This is not a flaw of character, it is a stage of growth in emotional intelligence. Daniel Goleman emphasizes that emotional intelligence is not just about awareness, but about regulation. Without regulation, even the most valuable emotional skills can become liabilities. For empaths, the absence of boundaries often leads to exhaustion. Constant emotional attunement requires energy, and when that energy is spent without replenishment, empathy begins to feel like depletion rather than connection. Experience gradually teaches what instruction rarely does. Repeated emotional overload forces the empath to confront a difficult reality. Compassion without limits is unsustainable. Burnout, resentment, or withdrawal often serve as signals that something must change. These moments, while painful, are critical turning points. They push the empath toward a more mature relationship with their own emotional capacity. Boundaries emerge not from indifference, but from clarity. The empath begins to recognize where their responsibility ends and another person's responsibility begins. This distinction is subtle but transformative. Instead of reacting automatically to every emotional cue, the empath learns to pause. They ask themselves whether engagement is necessary, helpful, or healthy. This pause is the beginning of self-regulation. Goleman's work highlights self-regulation as a core component of emotional intelligence. It involves managing impulses, choosing responses, and aligning actions with long-term values rather than immediate emotional pressure. When empaths develop this skill, their empathy becomes intentional. They still understand others deeply, but they are no longer compelled to fix, rescue, or absorb. As boundaries strengthen, empathy changes in quality. It becomes calmer, more focused, and more discerning. The empath can offer presence without self-sacrifice and understanding without entanglement. Emotional energy is invested where it can make a meaningful difference, rather than being scattered across every demand or crisis. This shift often coincides with an increased sense of inner stability. The empath no longer feels at the mercy of their environment. External emotions are noticed, but they do not automatically dictate internal states. This stability allows for clearer thinking, better decision-making, and more balanced relationships. What once felt like vulnerability now functions as a refined skill. Empathy, guided by boundaries, becomes a source of strength rather than strain. It supports leadership, collaboration, and trust, while preserving the empath's own well-being. In Goleman's terms, this is emotional intelligence in action, awareness paired with regulation, sensitivity paired with choice. Through boundaries, the empath learns not to feel less, but to feel wisely. With time and experience, the empath's early sensitivity begins to organize itself into discernment. What was once an unfiltered flow of emotional information becomes a structured form of perception. The empath no longer just feels what is happening in a room. They understand it. This shift is central to emotional intelligence as Daniel Goleman describes it, the movement from raw awareness to informed insight. Repeated exposure to human behavior teaches the empath how emotions follow patterns. They begin to notice consistencies between what people feel, what they say, and how they act. Small signals that once felt overwhelming now feel informative. A change in tone, a hesitation before a response, or a mismatch between words and body language becomes meaningful data rather than emotional noise. Goleman emphasizes that empathy involves accurate perception, not emotional fusion. Mature empathy is less about absorbing emotions and more about interpreting them. As empaths gain experience, they refine this interpretive ability. They learn that emotions are often layered and that surface reactions rarely tell the whole story. Anger may mask fear, confidence may conceal insecurity, and friendliness may coexist with self-interest. This understanding sharpens judgment. The empath becomes better at distinguishing sincerity from performance, concern from control, and openness from manipulation. This is not cynicism, it is emotional literacy. The empath has seen enough patterns repeat to recognize when something feels inconsistent or misaligned. Intuition in this context is simply rapid pattern recognition built over time. Self-awareness plays an important role in this process. Goleman notes that understanding others depends on understanding oneself. As empaths learn to regulate their own emotional responses, they reduce projection. They become less likely to assume that what they feel is what others intend. This creates space for clearer observation and more accurate interpretation. As a result, mature empaths often appear unusually perceptive. They sense tensions before they escalate, notice shifts in motivation, and anticipate emotional outcomes. In groups, they can read the collective mood and understand how it may influence decisions or behavior. This ability is especially valuable in leadership, negotiation, and conflict resolution, where unspoken dynamics often matter more than formal arguments. Importantly, this perceptiveness is paired with restraint. The empath does not announce every insight or react to every signal. Goleman's research highlights the importance of impulse control in emotionally intelligent behavior. Knowing what is happening does not always require immediate response. Sometimes the most effective action is patience, silence, or strategic timing. Over time, this combination of awareness and restraint gives the empath quiet authority. People feel understood, even when little is said. Trust develops because interactions feel grounded and attuned rather than reactive. The empath's presence becomes stabilizing. What began as sensitivity evolves into situational intelligence. The empath sees beyond surface interactions into underlying emotional structures. This ability does not dominate a room, but it shapes outcomes. It allows the empath to navigate complexity with clarity, making informed choices that align understanding with purpose. As emotional intelligence matures, the empath's influence begins to show most clearly in relationships and leadership roles. What distinguishes the empath at this stage is not charisma or authority in the traditional sense, but the ability to create emotional safety. Daniel Goleman has consistently emphasized that people perform, cooperate, and grow best when they feel understood and respected. Mature empaths naturally foster this environment. In leadership settings, this quality changes how power is exercised. Instead of relying on control or pressure, the empath leads through attunement. They listen carefully, notice unspoken concerns, and respond in ways that acknowledge both task and emotion. This does not slow progress, it often accelerates it. When people feel seen, resistance drops and engagement rises. Trust becomes the foundation of performance. Goleman's research on leadership styles highlights empathy as a key factor in effective leadership, particularly in complex or stressful environments. Leaders who recognize emotional realities can address problems before they escalate. Empathic leaders sense morale shifts early, understand the emotional impact of decisions, and adjust their approach accordingly. This awareness allows them to balance results with sustainability, preventing burnout and disengagement. In personal relationships, a similar transformation occurs. The mature empath no longer seeks connection through overgiving or self-erasure. Boundaries allow intimacy to develop on healthier terms. Emotional depth becomes a shared experience rather than a one-sided effort. The empath listens deeply, but also expresses needs clearly. This balance fosters mutual respect and long-term stability. Goleman notes that emotionally intelligent relationships depend on accurate emotional communication. Mature empaths excel at this. They can name emotions without blaming, address conflict without escalation, and offer understanding without enabling unhealthy behavior. As a result, their relationships tend to be resilient. Disagreements are navigated rather than avoided, and repair becomes possible because emotional awareness guides the process. Another shift occurs in how validation is sought. Earlier in life, empaths may look outward for reassurance, using empathy as a way to secure acceptance. With maturity, validation becomes internal. The empath's sense of worth is no longer dependent on being needed or approved of. This internal grounding enhances their presence. They engage from choice, not compulsion. Over time, people are drawn to this steadiness. Teams trust empathic leaders because their actions feel consistent and fair. Partners feel secure because emotional responses are predictable and sincere. This reliability is a form of quiet power. It does not demand attention, but it earns loyalty. What ultimately sets mature empaths apart is integration. Understanding, regulation, and connection work together. Empathy informs decisions without overwhelming them. Leadership becomes relational rather than positional. Relationships become collaborative rather than compensatory. In Goleman's framework, this is emotional intelligence fully expressed, where awareness shapes action and influence grows not from dominance but from genuine human understanding. The development of empathy follows a different timeline than traits that are immediately rewarded by society. Qualities such as assertiveness, competitiveness, and bold self-promotion often produce early visibility and quick recognition. Empathy, by contrast, grows quietly. Its benefits are cumulative, unfolding through years of experience, reflection, and emotional learning. Daniel Goleman's work helps explain why this slower path often leads to more enduring forms of success. Emotional intelligence strengthens with age because it is shaped by lived experience rather than rapid achievement. Each interaction adds nuance. Each failure or misunderstanding refines perception. Over time, the empath's understanding becomes layered and stable. This contrasts with early success driven primarily by external validation, which can peak quickly and become difficult to sustain under pressure. Goleman emphasizes that emotions influence attention, memory, and decision-making. Individuals who lack emotional awareness may perform well in structured, predictable environments, but struggle when conditions change. Empaths, having spent years navigating emotional complexity, tend to adapt more effectively. They remain attentive under stress, adjust behavior thoughtfully, and recover more quickly from setbacks. As careers and relationships grow more complex later in life, these abilities become increasingly valuable. Technical skill alone is rarely sufficient at higher levels of responsibility. Decisions affect people, morale, and long-term culture. The empath's capacity to sense emotional consequences allows for wiser choices. This foresight reduces unnecessary conflict and supports sustainable progress. Another important factor is resilience. Empaths often experience difficulty earlier in life, but these challenges build emotional stamina. They learn how to process disappointment, manage uncertainty, and find meaning beyond immediate outcomes. Goleman's research shows that resilience is a key component of emotional intelligence, enabling individuals to persist without becoming rigid or detached. With maturity, the empath's influence becomes less reactive and more intentional. They no longer chase approval or urgency. Instead, they operate from clarity and values. This steadiness has a grounding effect on others. In environments marked by volatility or stress, such presence becomes a stabilizing force. The contrast with early peaking personalities becomes more apparent over time. Without emotional regulation, early success can lead to burnout, strained relationships, or loss of direction. Empaths, having learned to integrate emotion with action, are less likely to exhaust themselves or others. Their progress may appear slower, but it is more durable. Ultimately, the empath's power lies in integration rather than intensity. Emotional awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skill converge into a coherent whole. This integration supports influence that grows rather than fades. In Goleman's terms, emotional intelligence compounds. It deepens with use, expands with experience, and sustains performance across changing circumstances. What unfolds later in life is not sudden transformation, but the natural result of long-term emotional learning. The empath's strength endures because it is rooted in understanding, guided by reflection, and aligned with human reality.